Welcome to Potty, May 8th, 2026. A deep dive. Here's the tension I want you to sit with for the next 12 minutes. The same decision that made your school, your university, your kid's classroom more efficient. Moving everything to the cloud, subscribing to a SaaS platform instead of running your own servers. That exact decision may have just exposed 280 million people's personal data in a single attack. One vendor. One breach, thousands of institutions simultaneously compromised, and none of them had any real control over it. That's the Canvas LMS breach, that's ShinyHunters, and that's the structural crack in cloud SaaS that this incident just blew wide open. We're going to go deep on all of it. Let me give you the quick preview of where we're going. We'll start with who Canvas is and why this matters so much. Because if you haven't used Canvas yourself, your kid probably has, or your professor did, or your employer's training platform runs on it. Then we'll get into ShinyHunters, a threat actor group that is genuinely one of the most prolific and technically capable data extortion operations active right now. Then we dig into the mechanism, because the attack vector here is really the story. And then we talk about what this means structurally for cloud SaaS, for education, for regulation, and honestly, for all of us who've handed our data to platforms we don't actually control. Let's go. Canvas LMS, the learning management system, is built and operated by a company called Instructure Holdings. And when I say dominant in global education, I want you to actually feel the scale of that. Estimates put it at over 8,800 institutions. We're talking K-12 schools, community colleges, Ivy League universities, institutions in Australia, in Europe, across every continent where English language or Western-style higher ed operates. Tens of millions of students, tens of millions of teachers and staff. Canvas is where assignments get submitted, where grades live, where students send private messages to their professors, where personal identifiers and institutional affiliations and communication records all accumulate over years of use. It is, in the language of security, an extremely high-value data store. And here's the critical architecture point. Canvas is cloud-hosted SaaS. The institutions don't run it. Instructure does. So when you subscribe to Canvas, you're not getting a piece of software you install. You're getting access to Instructure's infrastructure, Instructure's environment, Instructure's security posture. Here's what most people get wrong about cloud SaaS. They think that because a vendor is big and well-resourced and professional, the security is automatically better than what an individual institution could do on its own. And in some ways, that's true. Large SaaS vendors can hire dedicated security teams, run bug bounty programs, maintain compliance certifications. But there's a flip side that doesn't get talked about enough. When you concentrate data from 80,800 institutions into a single vendor's environment, you create a target that is extraordinarily attractive. You've traded the risk of 8,800 individual breaches for the risk of one catastrophic breach that hits all 8,800 simultaneously. That's not necessarily a bad trade, but it is a fundamentally different risk profile, and it requires a fundamentally different security model. And my read is that most institutions, especially in education, have not fully internalized that shift. They're still thinking in perimeter defense terms, firewalls, endpoint protection, network monitoring, for a threat that now lives entirely outside their perimeter. Now let's talk about ShinyHunters, because this group deserves serious attention. They are not script kiddies. They are not opportunists running basic credential stuffing attacks against weak passwords. ShinyHunters is a well-documented, prolific cybercriminal group with a track record that includes Ticketmaster, AT&T, Santander Bank, some of the highest-profile data breaches of the last several years. Their model is data extortion. They get in, they exfiltrate at scale, and then they threaten to publish or sell the data unless they're paid. What's notable about their evolution as a threat actor is that their methods have become increasingly sophisticated. They've moved from relatively blunt force credential attacks towards something much more technically interesting, API abuse. And that evolution matters enormously for understanding what happened to Canvas. There's also a detail in the reporting that I think is underplayed, and it appears in a headline framing I came across. Instructure Canvas breach, ShinyHunters strikes a second time. If that framing is accurate, and the sourcing suggests this appears to be a second significant ShinyHunters action against Instructure, that raises a really uncomfortable question. Did Instructure not fully remediate after the first incident? Did ShinyHunters maintain persistent access? Or were they able to re-exploit the same or a similar vulnerability? We don't have confirmed answers to those questions yet, and I want to be careful not to overstate what the reporting supports. But the pattern of repeated targeting is a signal worth watching. In my experience analyzing breach patterns, when a sophisticated threat actor returns to the same target, it usually means one of two things. Either the initial access was never fully closed, or the target is so valuable that they developed new capabilities specifically to get back in. Neither explanation is particularly common. Okay, so let's get into the mechanism, because this is where the story gets technically really significant. One headline I came across puts it plainly. ShinyHunters abuses Canvas native APIs to exfiltrate 280 million. That's the attack vector, not a perimeter breach, not a phishing campaign that landed malware on an employee's laptop, not a vulnerability in the web application layer. The attack path went through Canvas's own native APIs, the legitimate designed-to-be-used programming interfaces that allow Canvas to integrate with other tools, enable automation, support third-party applications. Let me explain why that's so important and so difficult to defend against. Modern SaaS platforms expose rich APIs because that's how the ecosystem works. Canvas needs to talk to student information systems, to Zoom for video classes, to plagiarism detection tools, to grade passback systems, to 100 different third-party integrations. To do all of that, Canvas has APIs, endpoints that accept requests, authenticate callers, and return data. Those APIs are not a bug. They're a core feature. But here's the security challenge. If an attacker gets hold of valid API credentials or finds a way to abuse API endpoints that aren't properly authenticated, rate-limited, or monitored, they can make what looks like completely legitimate traffic. They're not triggering intrusion detection systems that look for port scans or malformed packets. They're sending API requests that look to the monitoring infrastructure, like normal integration traffic. And if those APIs can return records in bulk, or can be queried iteratively across a large dataset, you've got a high-bandwidth exfiltration channel that is genuinely hard to distinguish from normal operations. That's what appears to have happened here, and that's why this attack vector is so alarming. The scale ShinyHunters is claiming is almost hard to process. They're asserting roughly 275 to 280 million records. Students, teachers, staff, across approximately 8,800 to 9,000 institutions. Bleeping Computers reporting, which I'd point listeners to as one of the more detailed sources on this, confirms that Instructure has formally acknowledged the breach and that the investigation into full scope is ongoing. ShinyHunters also shared a data sample with TechCrunch, which partially corroborated their claims. The data reportedly includes personal details, private messages, and account information. And named victims include top-tier universities. The headline framing I saw was Top Universities Among Victims Named in Canvas Data Breach. The breach has confirmed international scope, with Australia specifically called out, which makes sense given Canvas's significant penetration in Australian higher education. Now I want to zoom out and put this in structural context. Because the Canvas breach doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a pattern that has been building for years. Think about SolarWinds in 2020. A single vendor's software update mechanism was compromised, and suddenly thousands of government and enterprise customers were all simultaneously backdoored. Think about Movit in 2023. A SQL injection vulnerability in a widely used file transfer platform was exploited by the Clear0p ransomware group, and the blast radius hit hundreds of organizations across healthcare, government, finance, and education. Think about the Snowflake-adjacent breaches in 2024, where attackers went after the data warehousing platform layer to access customer data at scale. What's really going on here is that supply chain attacks on SaaS vendors have become a recognized, established, and increasingly preferred attack category. Because the economics are extraordinary. You compromise one vendor, you get access to thousands of downstream customers. The effort to impact ratio is the best in the threat actor playbook. And education specifically is a particularly attractive target for a few compounding reasons. First, the data density is remarkable. An LMS like Canvas doesn't just have names and email addresses. It has years of accumulated communication records, private messages between students and professors, assignment submissions, grade histories, behavioral patterns. It has data on minors, which creates enormous legal exposure under frameworks like FERPA in the US and equivalent regulations in other countries. Second, the security resourcing in education is chronically underfunded. A large university might have a reasonably capable security team, but the average K-12 school district, they might have one IT person who also manages the printer fleet. The security posture is weak relative to the value of the data. And third, this is the one that really frustrates me as someone who watches this space. The institutions often don't even know what data they've accumulated in these platforms. Canvas has been running for years. Data minimization is rarely practiced. So the blast radius of any breach is enormous because the data store has been growing unchecked. Let me talk about the shared responsibility model, because this is where I think institutions have been operating under a dangerous illusion. When you subscribe to a SaaS platform, you don't transfer security responsibility to the vendor. What you transfer is operational control. Instructure runs the infrastructure. Instructure manages the patching, the uptime, the database administration. But the legal and reputational exposure for a breach of your students' data, that largely stays with the institution. FERPA violations, notification obligations, parent and student inquiries, potential litigation, all of that lands on the institution, even though they had no visibility into and no control over the vendor's security practices. That's a structural mismatch that the Canvas breach is going to make impossible to ignore. The headline framing I saw, "The Instructure data breach proves traditional K-12 defenses are failing," is correct, but I'd push it further. It's not just that the defenses are failing, it's that the defenses institutions are pointed at the wrong threat model entirely. So what should institutions actually be doing differently? Because I don't want this to just be an autopsy, I want it to be actionable. The first thing is vendor security due diligence that goes beyond checking a SOC 2 compliance box. SOC 2 tells you that a vendor has controls in place. It doesn't tell you whether those controls are actually effective against a sophisticated threat actor abusing native APIs. You need to ask vendors specific questions. How are API calls rate limited? How is anomalous API behavior detected? What logging exists and can customers access those logs? What's the incident response timeline and notification commitment? These aren't exotic questions. They're the baseline for a meaningful vendor security assessment. And if a vendor can't answer them clearly, that's a signal. Second, contracts need to be revisited. Shared responsibility needs to be explicit, not assumed. And breach notification timelines need to be contractually enforceable, not just vendor policy best effort. For the broader SaaS industry, and I'm talking well beyond education here, the Canvas breach is a forcing function on API security. For too long, API security has been treated as a secondary concern, something you bolt on after the fact with a basic API gateway. What this incident demonstrates, and what the Snowflake adjacent breaches demonstrated before it, is that API layer attacks are now a primary attack surface. The controls that need to be in place aren't optional enhancements. They're table stakes! Rate limiting that's actually calibrated to detect bulk exfiltration. Behavioral anomaly detection that can recognize when an API caller is iterating through records in a pattern inconsistent with legitimate integration behavior. Zero Trust API access controls that require continuous validation, not just initial authentication. And this is the one I'd push hardest for. Real-time API audit logging that is shared with customers, so institutions can actually see what's happening in their data. Right now, most SaaS vendors treat API logs as their own internal operational data. That needs to change. Let's talk about the downstream risk for the people whose data was actually taken, because it's easy to get lost in the technical and structural analysis and forget that there are real people on the other end of this. The data reportedly includes personal identifiers, private messages, and account information. When you combine those elements, you know who someone is, where they go to school, who they communicate with, what they've said in private messages. You have an extraordinarily rich profile for social engineering, for phishing campaigns that are highly targeted and believable because they reference real details the attacker shouldn't know, for identity fraud. And critically, a significant portion of this data involves minors. K-12 students, the regulatory exposure under FERPA for U.S. institutions is significant, and equivalent frameworks in Australia and elsewhere create similar legal risk. But beyond the legal exposure, there's a genuine harm dimension here that I think deserves to be named directly. Children's data, accumulated over years of schooling, is now potentially in the hands of a criminal extortion group. That's not abstract. That's serious. Now let me get into predictions. And I want to be clear that what I'm offering here is pattern matching from observed breach precedents, not first principles research or confirmed intelligence. But the signals are strong enough that I think they're worth naming. The first trajectory I'd watch is regulatory and litigation pressure. The MOVEit breach in 2023 is the clearest precedent. One vendor vulnerability, hundreds of downstream victims. And what followed was a wave of class action litigation and regulatory inquiries that took years to fully resolve. The Canvas breach has several characteristics that suggest a similar or larger response. The involvement of minors, the multi-jurisdictional nature of the exposure, the scale of 280 million records, and the fact that Instructure appears to have been targeted more than once. My read is that we're going to see litigation targeting both Instructure and potentially the institutions that failed to conduct meaningful vendor security due diligence. And I think regulators, particularly in the US and Australia, are going to use this as a forcing function to update FERPA and equivalent frameworks for a world where student data lives in multi-tenant vendor clouds, not on campus servers. The second prediction is one that I think most people haven't fully landed on yet, and it's the more technically interesting one. Based on ShinyHunters' demonstrated capability to abuse native SaaS APIs at scale, and this technique was also visible in the Snowflake adjacent breaches of 2024. I think API layer attacks on major SaaS platforms are going to become the dominant breach vector in 2025 and 2026. Not the most common. Credential phishing will always be common because it's low effort. But the highest impact, highest scale breaches, they're going to go through the API layer because that's where the data is accessible in bulk, and that's where the controls are currently weakest. What that means practically is that I'd expect to see a significant market shift toward API security monitoring tools. Companies that can sit in front of or alongside SaaS APIs and detect anomalous access patterns in real time. And I'd expect to see enterprise customers, not just in education but in healthcare, financial services, government, start demanding contractual requirements around API audit logging and anomaly detection as a condition of SaaS procurement. That's a market that doesn't fully exist yet in the form it needs to. Here's the contrarian take that I think is worth sitting with, because it cuts against the instinct to just blame the vendor and move on. There's a version of this story where institutions bear significant responsibility, not for the breach itself, but for the conditions that made its impact so large. Most institutions that subscribe to Canvas have never conducted a meaningful security assessment of Instructure's practices. They've accepted the standard contract, checked the compliance checkbox, and moved on. They don't know what data Canvas is holding on their behalf, because they've never inventoried it. They don't have contractual rights to API audit logs, because they never asked for them. And they've built their security programs around perimeter defense that is completely irrelevant to a vendor layer attack. If we're serious about fixing this problem, not just reacting to this breach, but actually changing the structural conditions, institutions need to accept that cloud SaaS procurement is now a security decision, not just an IT decision, and it needs to be resourced and governed accordingly. If you're watching this space in 2025, I think you're going to look back and remember this as the moment when the education sector, And honestly, the broader SaaS ecosystem could no longer pretend that vendor security was someone else's problem. The Canvas breach is not an outlier. It's a data point in a trend that has been building through SolarWinds, through Movit, through Snowflake, and it's now arrived in the most data-sensitive, least defended sector in the enterprise landscape: education. The question isn't whether more breaches like this are coming. Based on the economics of supply chain attacks and the maturity gap in SaaS API security, the answer to that is almost certainly yes. The question is whether the response from regulators, from vendors, from institutions, from the security industry is going to be fast enough and substantive enough to actually change the trajectory. And right now, I'm not optimistic. Let me bring this home with the arc of what we've covered, because I want you to leave with something concrete. We started with a single breach: Canvas LMS, ShinyHunters, 280 million records, 8,800 institutions. We unpacked why that scale is possible, because cloud SaaS concentrates data at the vendor layer, and one vendor breach cascades to every downstream customer simultaneously. We went deep on the attack vector: API abuse, not perimeter attack, and why that's so difficult to detect and defend against with conventional security controls. We looked at the structural vulnerabilities in education, data density, regulatory exposure, under-resourced security teams, and a failure to practice data minimization. And we identified the systemic mismatch: institutions that transferred operational control to a vendor, but retained all the legal and reputational risk, without the visibility or contractual leverage to actually verify that the vendor's security was adequate. For listeners who want to go deeper, and I genuinely encourage this, look for Bleeping Computer's reporting on the Instructure breach confirmation. Look at TechCrunch's coverage of the ShinyHunters data sample sharing. Read up on the Mozip breach litigation history if you want to understand what the regulatory and legal aftermath of a supply chain SaaS breach actually looks like. And if you're in an institution that uses Canvas or any other major SaaS platform, the most useful thing you can do right now is pull out your vendor contract and find the section on security obligations, breach notification timelines, and data handling. You might be surprised, or more accurately, you might be alarmed by what you find or don't find. The research is out there. The questions are now unavoidable. And the next breach of this type is not a matter of if, it's a matter of which platform, and whether we'll have learned anything useful by the time it happens.